A 16.5% property tax hike. That's what residents of Toronto are facing. Hi, I'm Brian Lilly, political columnist for the Toronto Sun. I know an awful lot of you are outside of Toronto are saying you get what you voted for. You voted for an NDP mayor. You're going to get NDP policies. That's part of what's going on here, but few of us expected that we would see a proposed property tax hike of 16.5%. Now, Olivia Chow's team will tell you no, it's a 9% property tax hike, not 16.5. Here's the reality. It's a 9% property tax hike, a 1.5% tax hike added on for building and transit funds, and then, unless the feds pony up $250 million for refugee beds, another 6%. As I said in my column at the Toronto Sun, it's like Mayor Chow has the Toronto residents in a hostage situation, a gun to our heads, and she's telling the feds, if you don't pony up, I'm going to shoot. Not a very comfortable situation. One man who was saying from the beginning that Olivia Chow would lead to big tax hikes is Brad Bradford. He is a city councillor for Beaches East York. He ran in the last mayoral election as a candidate to replace John Tory, losing to Olivia Chow. But Brad, wow, were you ever right on this? I mean, off by a little bit, but not by a lot. She's closer to the 20% you claimed than anything any of us would have dreamed.
I think at the moment, the idea of 0% tax increase is fantasy land, and I think we're all smart enough and have looked at the City Hall budget to understand that. But also, you know, the alternative and Olivia Chow's 20% tax increase, people cannot afford that.
Yeah, I have to admit, I think all of us were a little bit shocked last night when we learned it was going to be 10.5% plus a potential 6%, if the federal government doesn't pony up. And the hostage situation scenario, that's kind of what we all feel like right now. Look, this is a nightmare scenario for Toronto taxpayers. And to me, when I think about all the challenges families are facing right now, costs are through the roof. Whether you're talking about your grocery bill, filling up your car at the pump, your rent, your mortgage, it's all more money. And completely tone deaf from Olivia Chow to go out and saddle people with the biggest tax hike in the city of Toronto's history.
Well, you've got to remember that it's annual tax hikes, and for years the plan was keep it to the rate of inflation. So forgive me while I do a little math here on the air. I'm just going to bring up the calculator. So for every $100 in municipal taxes that you paid in 2022, last year there was a 7% property tax hike. So that's $107 instead of 100. Now you add on, if we get to it, 16.5%. Now you're talking about $124.65 for what 2 years ago cost you $100. I'm sorry, but service levels are not 25% better than they were 2 years ago, in my view. And I don't know what you hear from your residents. I don't live in your ward, but my view, my complaint is that services are getting worse, not better, on the basics. Garbage collection, roads, what we need municipalities to look after, they're not. Our parks are, many of them, uninhabitable for various reasons because people are living in them, but you can't use them. Services aren't better, they're worse, but we're being asked to pay 25% more in property taxes than we were 2 years ago. How does that fly at City Hall?
You're paying more and you're getting less.
We have to address the housing crisis, to make the city safer, to fix the system, the transit system, to improve city services. The message was clear. We also have to deal with the budget hole, deficit, whatever you want to call it, left behind by the pandemic and our current reluctant partners in Ottawa and Queen's Park.
That is a failing business proposition in any other sector, but with NDP Mayor Olivia Chow, that seems like that's business as usual. And the reality is here, Brian, it's 10.5% to 16.5% this year. What is it going to be next year and the year after? And it compounds year after year. It's really interesting hearing the mayor suggest that she's consumed with the issue of affordability. So I don't care if you're a homeowner or a renter, someone who's coming to do business here in the city, this makes it more expensive for literally everyone. this will make your life more expensive in the city that's already one of the most expensive to live in the entire country.
Well, in all of North America. A lot of renters don't realize that property tax hikes is one of the things that landlords can pass on to you. That
And
is
in
a flow through.
situations like this, the Landlord Tenancy Act specifically states you can do an above guideline increase if you are facing an extraordinary municipal tax hike. And I think given that this is the largest tax hike in the city of Toronto's history, this probably checks the box for extraordinary circumstances. So, for folks out there saying this isn't a problem for me, I'm not a homeowner, I rent, and 50% of the population here in the city falls into that category, you better believe this is going to translate into higher rents next year as landlords go out to try and recover those costs, because it's a lot more expensive for them too, and that gets passed right through.
Yeah. And even if we only get to 10.5%, if the feds pony up, that is still high enough for it to be a flow through and for renters to have to pay. But let me ask you about the potential for the Trudeau Liberal government to come through with that $250,000. I'll be upfront. I've written columns about this. I think they do owe the city that money. I also don't think they're going to pay it. Not all of it. They've shown no indication of that. I've heard nothing from the 24 of the 25 MPs who represent Toronto, who are members of the Liberal Party caucus. I've heard nothing from any of them suggesting that this is something they should be acting on. They seem to just want to be whistling past the graveyard on this. Ignore the issue and it will go away. But this is, the 6% add-on, this is for refugee services, for settlements. And if you followed the numbers, then you know that, this is not anti-immigrant, anti-refugee hysteria. The vast majority of shelter spaces are being taken up by an influx of refugees. It used to be Roxham Road in Quebec, and then they were bussed here. Now it's people showing up by the thousands each month at Pearson Airport and being sent to downtown Toronto. So that is putting a huge strain on the shelter system, and it should be paid for by the federal government. They're responsible for immigration. They're responsible for securing borders. They're not doing their job, but they also don't seem interested in paying this bill. Have you heard anything that would indicate otherwise?
I haven't heard that they're coming through with that money at the moment. And look, the reality is that is something that the federal government needs to address. But a question that I would ask if I was the province or the federal government is, look, we have literally flowed billions of dollars over the past number of years, hundreds of millions of dollars this year. The province stepped up in a big way, $330 million for operating. They uploaded the DVP in the Gardner, which I think was the right thing to do, but that relieved $1 billion of pressure on our capital budget. And the federal government just 3 weeks ago came into town and wrote a check for nearly $500 million. So the refugee piece needs to be resolved. That is a federal issue. But the first question I would be asking the mayor is, what steps have you taken to save the city money? What efficiencies have you tried to find within your service delivery? And I think the answer is, when you come forward with a 10.5% tax hike, the answer is none. I actually asked the mayor and her allies in September to undertake a core services review. The last time this was done was under former Mayor Rob Ford, and it talks about what services the city ought to be delivering, who's best positioned to supply those services, and who ought to pay for it. So as we were going into intergovernmental negotiations, conversations with the province, conversations with the federal government, wouldn't you want to have that information? Wouldn't you want to arm yourself with that information for those negotiations? Mayor Chow said she didn't want to have that information. She wasn't interested in that exercise where we could find those savings and those efficiencies. And now we're in this unenviable position of moving into a budget cycle at speed, where she puts a double-digit tax hike on the table and just sort of says to everybody, eat it.
That core services review, I mean, I look at so many things that happen around me, some odd streetscaping that went on in my neighborhood, that they put in things, geometric shapes, and these pieces of steel that look like what you'd see a farmer used to put the hay bales in for the cows to come and feed out of. And they put them in the streets, and they'll say it's traffic calming measures. Well, it also blocks the sewer systems. It costs a lot of money. There are easier ways to do traffic calming. The city seems to have no problem spending money on issues like this, or the giant signs to let you know that you can drink in certain parks. In a study on that, when all they had to do was say, okay, the province allows it, let's see how it goes. Or renaming Yonge Dundas Square after Sankofa, which 3/4 of the residents of the city in all areas of the city are against. Mayor Chow doesn't seem to have a problem spending money. She just seems to have a problem saving money or looking at what, is actually a core responsibility.
Brian, in the campaign, Mayor Chow promised people a moderate tax increase. Double digits and historic, the largest ever, is by no means moderate. But she also said to people, I've been on the budget committee. I'm very good at budgets. Well, if very good at budgets means tax and spend, an NDP budget, then yes, that seems to be a very good way of doing budgeting for Mayor Chow. But the reality is, rather than taking the time to find efficiencies and savings, and that's the hard part of budgeting, spending money for Olivia Chow is not the problem. It's finding the savings and the efficiencies. She has spent her time renaming Yonge and Dundas Square, imposing a unilateral cap on rideshare, and spending a lot of political currency with other levels of government that hasn't translated into resolving those critical issues like the refugee crisis facing everyone here in Toronto. So mismanagement, time not well spent, and Toronto taxpayers are going to pay for it.
All right, Bradford, thanks for the time, and we'll continue to watch what you do at council over the next little while. It's going to be an interesting budget deliberation session.
Thank you, Brian.
All right, let me know what you think. Drop a comment down below, share this on social media, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.